following program on Derana 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations. We would like to remind our viewers that the views expressed in this program by our participating guests are solely viewpoints of them who take part, and does not reflect the views and beliefs of the Derana Media Network.
Welcome down to Gen XYZ right here on Derana 24. We're in conversation with three very important individuals talking about something very essential in Sri Lanka. We're talking about digital disinformation. We also speak about hate speech. We see a lot of things happening in Sri Lanka, so many disastrous things, but yet we need to talk about one thing, and that's the culprit of all of this. This is hate speech and disinformation on social media. Well, that's exactly why we're joining in with two brilliant individuals, of course, three, to me, quite honest. I'm very glad to have them on board the show today. We are joining in with Kirtika, who's obviously a digital peace building specialist with extensive experience in advocating for gender experiences when it comes to advocating gender equality and social inclusion as well. We're also joining with Saritha on this side. Well, thank you so much for doing us right here on Gen XYZ. We're joining with many of the experiences that she's actually collected. We're talking about a policy researcher focusing on intentions of gender, technology and accountability in Sri Lanka. And then we also have Nabila Iqbal, who's a little bit of a star, by the way. She's gone towards Hollywood a little bit as well, but we're very excited to have you on board as well. She is an activist, peace building with legal backgrounds as well. She's also the founder of Sisterhood Initiative, and she really focuses in terms of building women, especially in societies of Sri Lanka. Well, we're in conversation once again, so thank you so much for joining us today on Gen XYZ. Well, we got to really jump into it because it's a very important conversation, and I feel like recently something took place where I think it really broke us all apart, and this is with regards to depression and how it sort of leads to this as well, and you end up having people jumping out of the most iconic buildings and everything, which is very, very heartbreaking. But all of this comes with regards to disinformation, right? It always boils down to hate speech, whether it be physical hate speech, whether it be digital hate speech as well. We're always in social media. So what I want to ask, I think I'm going to ask you this personally, to be honest, is because hate speech per se is actually a very, very generic thing for us today. We're like, just take it from this ear, put it from the other ear. It never ends up that way. We always filter the information because it really affects us. How do you actually perceive this, especially in Sri Lanka? What do you have to say when it comes to navigating hate speech, especially with the stats in Sri Lanka as well?
Right. I think before going to all of that, we need to understand what hate speech is, what misinformation and what disinformation is. And just a heads up, all of these definitions that I'm going to tell is evolving and it's work in progress. So nothing is on concrete. For example, what hate speech is basically any content or any expression which is created or shared with the intent of harming or manipulating or kind of hurting a particular group or individual. And it can be any content. It can be image, or it can be hateful speech. In terms of writing, it can be reducing one's rights, campaigns on reducing one's rights based on the ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, caste, any of that sort. So that's hate speech. For example, I think Saritha would give you more information in terms of real life experiences, but just to kind of add on to Saritha's future statement would be like, for example, in 2018, because of a lot of hate speech, the Digana riots happened, and 3 people died, 20 people, I think 20 plus people kind of injured because of hate speech, just because of hate speech. And there were more than 50 plus businesses were kind of demolished. And in the end, Meta kind of understood the importance of how hate speech kind of induces violence, and they actually apologize. So that's hate speech for you. And disinformation is basically any information which is created intentionally to manipulate or harm anyone or anything, right? Now, for example, during the Easter attacks, for example, during that time, there were a lot of disinformation spreading in social media, saying that, you know, this minority community is going to take over Sri Lanka and they are going to, you know, do whatnot, right? So that is disinformation for you. And then misinformation, of course, disinformation and misinformation kind of sound the same, but there's a small difference. With misinformation, it's information which is created, but you don't have the intention to harm, but ultimately it will definitely harm someone with that information, and this information is spread either because of ignorance or lack of awareness or with misunderstanding, right? For example, during COVID, I remember I was told to, in a social media post, I was told to drink hand sanitizer so that the virus will be killed. Very simple, right?
Okay, yeah.
And some of us actually believed, well, not me, but you know, so those are things that we have to be very careful, and I think that is the context that we are looking at in Sri Lanka. And in Sri Lanka, I think most of the hate speech is targeted towards minorities and women. I think in the recent UN report, I saw that 51% of the women were targeted with hate speech, and 24% of the minorities were targeted with hate speech and disinformation.
Why do you think it's the case? Because usually when we talk about, Sri Lanka as a whole, right, is a very small island. We cater to a wide spread of audiences when it comes to tourism and whatnot, right?
Yes.
As a hospitable country. But at the same time, we're the most socially weirdest people when it comes to really showcasing so much of hate. Like, why do we sort of attack these minority communities when, okay, one party is doing that, we follow the track and we're like, this is what we need to do, we're just going to go on social media, start commenting and everything. It's a very disastrous thing, but it actually is happening. Why do you think Sri Lanka, being a hospitable country, we still cater to actually, inducing all of these violences with hate speech?
That's a very interesting question, because I think this hate speech misinformation is actually done by very small groups, not the whole country actually.
Yeah.
Let me tell you that. Now, for example, when you talk about the landscape and the historical aspect to it, we have gone through so many religious ethnic tensions. Then we have gone through the language policy disputes. Then we have gone through politically engineered polarization, and it still goes on. And then, of course, the recent economic crisis and all of that, right? So with all of this, the hate speech was always there. It kind of amplified with COVID-19 because everyone was then online. So the online space also kind of amplified with all of that, and hate speech kind of just went haywire, I think that is the main reason that this hate speech is, there, and misinformation, disinformation is very much there. And also there's a challenge because a lot of us in Sri Lanka, I know that with the current trend, I see a decrease in hate speech with the current government, and I think even in the election process there was less hate speech.
I think this was the most one that was barely any hate speech, much less rather. Yeah.
Definitely, but we saw a lot of campaigns, but it was not impactful, it was not successful. So in that lens, we also need to understand that just because that is decreased doesn't mean that it is not there. I know for sure there's a lot of women who are targeted, a lot of other minorities, gender diverse communities are targeted always, women journalists, women in politics, and I think Nabila will talk more on that. So that is always prevalent in Sri Lanka. And another challenge that I see is digital literacy. You see, you have two segments, I feel. One, you have the young people, they kind of lack the capacity, well, more than the maturity, the capacity to identify what is misinformation and hate speech and all of that. It evolves. With AI and all, even I don't sometimes, I feel that I can't identify certain things, And then you have the other segment which is more than 35, a bit elder, like me, right? So we don't, we have our own biases, with the historical development and all of that, and we all have our own perception. So with all of that bias, we are trying to counter hate speech. So those are the few challenges I see, especially with the digital literacy in the country's landscape.
Yeah, that's very interesting actually, because I feel like there's a lot that us Sri Lankans actually go through as well on a processing basis, but we never actually see, okay, it is a problem, we need to actually, do something about it. And that's the bigger problem there. And that's great that you guys are actually doing this conversation as well, an initiative to really drive this force, right? Now, I think something that she mentioned as well is in terms of personal experiences, right? I feel no matter what it is, you can talk about certain things, you can drive facts, you can drive quantitative information, but it never drives how, when you personally have gone through it, right? So what have you personally gone through, if you don't mind, me asking, exactly how it has sort of like, changed you and sort of built you to be this strong person, an activist and an advocate as well?
I think personally, working on platform accountability and researching tech-facilitated gender-based violence and hate speech has really shaped also my personal relationship with technology, especially understanding what these platforms have become. I try to stay offline a lot more, especially in the last couple of years, simply because of, I think, the relationship between people and these platforms have also evolved. So I think Kiru brought up the Derana riots briefly, and I think we've had several of those sort of sectarian tensions boil over because of things that happened, sort of started online pretty much, and then boiled over to the offline spaces. But we've also had, in Sri Lanka especially, incidents of, I think one of the more recent ones was this female comedian who was arrested under the ICCPR Act, and for allegedly saying inflammatory things against the Buddha, right? But what was sort of shrouded in a lot of the mainstream reporting of that, and something that we really researched back then, was the barrage of hate speech, the death threats, the rape threats, the disinformation, the doxing that she had to endure, and that she and her family had to really endure. So seeing things like that really also kind of shapes my relationship with platforms in a very fundamental way. Because I think when social media first started, it really was about socializing and keeping connected with people. But in recent times, we see a couple of different shifts. One is the platforms and their models have changed. It's all about engagement. It's all about how many eyeballs can we keep on a certain platform at a given time. It's all about how much data can we get from all of these online profiles that exist. How much data can we retain? How many privacy rights can we make users sign away because they tick a box without really looking at any of the terms, right? And then also tech platforms and their ownership, the way they've moved towards far-right politics, the way they've aligned themselves with very fascist sort of ideas, very populist ideas, and the way it has really transformed what we call the information landscape. So for me, I mean, I've also endured online harassment. I've not been doxxed, touch wood, not yet, but definitely a lot of online harassment, a lot of hate speech. And I don't think that this is a very new experience for anyone who's like feminine or who's a woman or who's a gender minority in Sri Lanka. I think all of us have been subjected to, more or less, different variations of it, but definitely a lot of problematic behavior online. And that has nothing to do with whether your presence online is private or public. You can have a fake profile online and you will still get harassed. You might still get sort of unsolicited nudes in your inbox and things like that. But what's really, I think, troubling for me is how, while our relationship with these platforms have evolved, it also has largely happened very unconsciously. A lot of us don't actively think about how these platforms are evolving, why they exist, why do we exist on these platforms, right? What do we actually provide to these multi-billion-dollar enterprises? So without sort of that type of conscious thinking, and this is what Kiru said about digital literacy, like part of that is digital literacy. Understanding what companies do with our data and why we exist online, for what purpose. I think when there's such a glaring lack of digital literacy, and South Asia has one of the lowest sort of digital literacy rates in the world, Sri Lanka has very low digital literacy, despite also having a very high sort of substantial rate of digital penetration.
Can I cut you off there a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Right? I want to dial back a little bit in terms of what you mentioned. You mentioned in terms of, whether even if you actually have a bot or whatever it is, right? A fake account, whatever it is, you are going to sort of forthcome in terms of, whether it be bullying, whether it be harassments or whatever it is, right? But you went through that personally. You as a girl in Sri Lanka, and according to what Kiri mentioned as well, is a minority community, right? But what about the multiple other people that probably might actually go through, disabilities, but they're still online, because that's the nature that we've actually grown into as Sri Lanka. They're going through that as well, right?
Yeah.
How was your experience in terms of navigating that? Because I think that is a bigger question, right? You are going to experience it, even there is no literacy when it comes to social media in Sri Lanka. And because of that base of things, we are succumbed to actually go through all of these things, bullying, harassment, even if you are fully well known or know exactly how social media works, you're still victim to it, because there's a lot more that goes into it, So that's what leads to depression. That's literally what leads to all of these things that we are so shocked and shivered by. How did you navigate that? Because that's what I want to know. Because I feel like everyone watching now as well.
Right.
Those kids that are probably going through it now, girls going through it now. How do you navigate that?
Personally, I don't think there's like a one-size-fits-all sort of model to navigating something like that. I think it really depends on personal circumstances. And I also come from a background of looking at sort of harm prevention, working with victim survivors, sort of trying to approach the different avenues available, right? So there's like the technological aspect of it, which is how do you deal with it technologically, about removing content, blocking, reporting, all of that. And then there's the legal avenues of it, which is do you then go and complain to the police and take like legal action? And then there are also other things. There's also how do you actually support someone who's going through it. So there's no one size fits all here at all. Your circumstances really determines what you are able to do and what support is available to you. But I think in general, like a good rule of thumb is when something happens to you, I think one of the things that generally happens is you either freeze or you panic, and people either tend to delete it, or they tend to deactivate their profile, or they tend to block whatever it is, right? One is don't engage with whatever harm is coming your way. Engagement only drives up more engagement. That's only going to invite more harm. Unfortunately, that is how it works. But definitely keep evidence. Take a screenshot, take a screen recording, whatever it is. And then I think also what is necessary then is to speak to someone who's trusted. I think if you're a minor especially, it's great if you can speak to a trusted adult. Because in Sri Lanka, for a lot of these procedures, especially legal and psychosocial routes, you need a legal guardian's consent, right? So good to speak to a trusted adult before panicking and sort of doing something that might invite a lot more harm. That's 2. Then 3, I think, would be to actually consult resources. So there are some fantastic resources online. One of the things I can recommend is Delete Nothing. They're an online platform, and they have a lot of resources on what avenues of justice are available to you. A lot of the times, as someone who has worked with sort of victim survivors and also gone through it myself, the main thing you want to do is to get the problematic content offline. If someone is harassing you, you want this sort of profile gone. You
mentioned something very interesting in terms of you have to take a screenshot of it and keep it as evidence. But then it comes into play of how it's going to be navigated in terms of the policymakers, right? Or there is no such thing where, okay, there is going to be consequences if you do this, if you take it to certain relevant individuals, right? We'll talk a little bit more on the other side. This is very interesting because it's very important as well, right?
Right.
This is Gen XYZ. We're in very important conversation rather with regards to why social media is a matter of platform that has actually taken over so many youth members, so many individuals as you as well watching right now. Well, we need to pin in all of these information when it comes to policy making, when it comes to really understanding the literacy of how we can navigate social media. We'll talk a little bit more on the other side, but this is Gen XYZ. Welcome back to Gen XYZ right here on Out There in 24, where we're in conversation about a very important thing, and this is of course disinformation on social media and how we can actually prevent this, plus hate speech that has actually taken a toll in all of us as youth members in Sri Lanka as well. We're in conversation with 3 activists, by the way, who's really driving the force when it comes to eradicating this aspect of things in our social base of things. Well, I think we actually spoke a little bit more on that thing, so we'll just carry it forward on this, right? In terms of how, for an example, okay, you don't really know how to navigate certain things, right? You are going to get unsolicited images, which you don't want to see at all. But it is Sri Lanka. You know, it unfortunately happens. You're going to get unsolicited information or comments about how you look. This is how you look. You know, you're compared to certain things or animals, or it's disgusting, to be honest, to see how a human can hate on another human so badly, and that's just disturbing. But people that actually are able to sort of receive it, do something about it, they would do the wrong things to the wrong extent of where they'll take a screenshot, they'll put it on their social media, on their personal social media, saying, hey, this is a warning, this is going to be, it's a predator, stay away and everything, but it only ends up being worse. And the worst part is, people that are actually like looking at it as well, could be your own friends or whatnot, would also support that person, saying, you don't have to do this, just ignore it, put it from the other ear, you know, don't even think about it. What do you have to say to those that actually would probably do this as well, or, you know?
I mean, as someone who's already also gone that route, let me say, inadvisable, very inadvisable. But I will say context also matters. I think the reason a lot of people resort to that is because platforms are unhelpful when it comes to removing problematic content or getting rid of problematic people. Platforms can be very unhelpful in maintaining, in building trust and ensuring safety of its users. That's one. 2 is because we also, as a country, don't have the best reputation in successfully dealing with online hate speech and harassment, right? We have institutions that are often quite inaccessible in a multitude of ways. So I think in situations like that, people also feel like this sort of vigilante justice is the only avenue available to them. At least in the instances that I did it, it was definitely because I had approached like a couple of institutions. They were not very helpful. This was on like Instagram, and Facebook was unhelpful. They said this does not violate, you know, guidelines and all that. So at some point you feel like, okay, this is also the only avenue available to me. But I think why that sort of thought process also happens upon reflection, and I think this is also true for a lot of people who take that avenue, is because we also don't reflect a lot on what justice and closure and all of these things can mean and look like and feel like, right? So when I said, you know, keep evidence and take screenshots, the end result of that is not necessarily post it on your page and say, okay, go and report this person, this is a predator, etc., etc. This is also why my second or third step was, please speak to someone who is trusted, who you can actually speak to, who will also have your best interests at heart, who's actually able to give you some advice. And 3 definitely is to refer to sort of resources that are well researched, that are well informed, that are also what we call victim or survivor centric, that really take your needs into account. So that's why I think Delete Nothing is like a great resource that you can refer to, and it's very accessible. It's in all 3 languages. You can actually go and see what your avenues are that are available. Based on those, you can do a couple of things. You can speak to an organization that can actually sort of put in a request to the platform to take problematic content down. I think now you can also speak to the Sri Lanka Computer Emergency Readiness Team, CERT, which has a hotline. I know they do some crucial work in this sector as well, even though it's not originally their mandate. They've really stepped into this vacuum to, you know, remove content. Yeah. And then I think with the legal process, I don't know a lot of people who really go the legal route. But then there are organizations who can actually at least sort of guide you in getting a legal consultation to really look at what avenues are available to you, right? So hashtag, for example, Hashtag Generation is one of those organizations. There's Sisters at Law, there's Women in Need. Like, you can actually approach these organizations and say, look, I'm going through something like this. Can I speak to a lawyer so I can understand what things are available to me? For a lot of the times,
and these are all locally available.
These are locally available, yeah. I think for a lot of the time when something like this happens, what's important is you don't give in to your instincts, or rather your want to sort of isolate and dig deeper into shame and embarrassment and all of that. What's really necessary is my like number one thing is collect evidence. The second thing is really like talk to someone, because that can also sometimes when you talk to someone, you also realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't panic this much.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't panic this much. Maybe I shouldn't be quick to judgment. Maybe I shouldn't rush to do certain things. And I can completely like personally attest to that. A lot of the times when I've done this ill-advised thing of like sharing it on the platform, it has also come from a place of not first talking to someone and be like, hey, this happened to me. I felt angry, I felt upset, I felt this, I felt that. So therefore, that's why I did it, right? So
I want to dialect a little bit more in terms of getting a legal aspect as well, right? Now, I come to you for that because you have a little bit of a legal background as well, right? Now, Nabila, I know you sort of have actually advocated very much on social media when it comes to many things. I see that on social media as well. I think everyone watching knows that this is your nature when it comes to advocating for the minorities, advocating for women, and, you know, in general as well. And that's amazing, to be honest. But you come from a legal background. What are the things when it comes to policy aspect of things that you think could be implemented? Because, you know, internationally, or even if you take in the US, there are certain policies where, okay, it is considered to be a crime. It is considered to be, okay, this is not okay. This is not okay. There are consequences for this. In Sri Lanka, we don't necessarily have that, unfortunately, right? So what do you have to say in terms of the policies that could be implemented in navigating these?
So, I mean, just to clarify, I'm not an attorney at law.
But you do have a legal background.
Yeah, but I think Sarita is the best person for more of the policy answers. But I'll just tell you, like, at least from an activist standpoint, right? It's kind of really centering the survivor or like the victims in these situations, or like people victimized in these situations, right? What we notice is like Kiru and Sarita all mentioned, there are so many resources available, but the problem is like now when a family goes to the women and children's desk, right, at the police station, they're like ping-ponged from place to place, go to CERT, go here to computer cyber crimes, and then actually for them to get something tangible to help themselves, it's very hard. And then the social media platforms are also, these are big companies that are making a profit. So even when you look at policy, right, those are very long-term things, because why should they listen to a victim? They're also trying to make money out of all these things that they want to like share, like they want people to share and use and increase screen time and things, right? So policy is important, and I think all of us kind of work in those little gaps, right? So what I've noticed is, especially in this recent parliamentary elections from last year, because we had more women taking part or contesting, and correct, compared to last elections, the viciousness of the attacks was less, overall less, but we had more women contesting. So the attacks cut through class, caste, ethnicity, religion and all of that. And what we've noticed is that the remedies available are not enough. And so like attacks online are not only limited to social media platforms. Like now let's say if an attack happens on WhatsApp, literally what do? You can report it. What would WhatsApp do if it's a forwarded message? It just keeps getting forwarded, right? And we saw that play out a lot against female candidates, right? Now let's say a lot of the first time candidates who were taking part, it really affected their political career. They couldn't receive votes because they weren't looking credible in their communities, right? And you saw the way the Prime Minister was labelled, their secretaries labelled, and the Minister for the Women and Child Affairs herself, right? So looking at all of these things, what I feel like is right now, yes, we have to engage with policymakers and try to look at tangible things, but also locally we have to kind of equip our institutions. Now let's say if it's the cybercrimes division or if it's CERT, right, we have to see, okay, what does the social media landscape actually look like, right, and understand what goes behind platforms, like how do you exactly report, under what grounds, is it nudity or this or ethnicity or racial attacks, like going really deep into what how we do it and kind of doing that training. I think that's really important right now, because sometimes that's all we have also, in my opinion, when we speak to victims. They're all like, get the post out, delete it. But like, yes, it's important to delete, but we also have to follow processes. So how do we train our local institutions also to do that is honestly, to me, that's really important. Yeah.
Okay, so I think all three of you sort of agree with one thing. It's in terms of literacy, right? Yeah. Literacy rates when it comes to digital media. What do you suggest that needs to be done, especially in schools? What needs to be incorporated in teaching these individuals that there is something called social media? This is something new for all of us. But even though we are all in it, we're connected to the entire world.
Yeah.
What do we have to be aware of? What do we need to sort of like educate ourselves on?
So I mean, when I was in school, not a long time ago, but we all had a subject called
I feel old.
we had a subject called civics, right? Like it's about how do you participate in society as a citizen, as a community member. But now we are also civic members online, right? We are citizens online as well. So like how do we treat each other with kindness, empathy, and how do we use these platforms? And that's really important, but it's also hard, no? Like social media platforms are changing every day. And Akhil, you mentioned this at the beginning, right? You said it could be a post online, but sometimes people hurt themselves in real life, right? So it's also about teaching, okay, yes, we have online content that people see and they read and they absorb, but they have real life consequences. For example, it could be a politician who's running for elections and can't get votes and doesn't go to parliament. Or it could be a girl whose schooling career is removed because of the way she's taunted in class, right? So it could be things like that. So it's about kind of educating young children at a very young age about how to kind of navigate that. And I think our education system also has to
change. It needs to
move.
Yeah,
it has to move. And also, like, let's say, even if we have a curriculum like that, the teachers also should understand how to teach that, because teachers also have biases. No, they could be like, oh, yes, I want you to report content, but also why did you post it? They might ask, right? So it's about looking at that entire kind of picture also. So I agree with you. I do think curriculum has to change.
Okay, you mentioned something a little contradictory there, right? In terms of when you said, okay, you know, teachers are biased because they also come from a very culturally different base of things.
They can be, yeah.
But also parents.
Yeah.
Parents are primarily the ones who would say, okay, no, why did you post this? This is your fault. Now, okay, what do we do? It's a whole thing. Culture, and I also think parenthood, right? That's something we need to really touch base on. We'll talk a little bit more on the other side, of course, right here on Gen XYZ. We're going to jump into a short commercial break. Welcome back to Gen XYZ right here on Out There in the 24. We're in conversation about something very, very important. We're talking about digital, well, Sri Lanka and social media. It doesn't really go hand in hand because there's so much disinformation. There's so much hate speech that goes around, causing quite a lot of danger in so many people's lives as well. Well, let me just remind you, this particular episode is of course supported in terms of strengthening social cohesion and peace in Sri Lanka, along with co-founded, of course, by the European Union and German Federal Foreign Office as well. The SCOPE program is implemented by GIZ in partnership with the government of Sri Lanka. So we're very excited to have this on board and really share the message out there in Sri Lanka as well. Well, we had a little conversation with regards to, you know, culture, right? I think Nabila, that's where we sort of like, you know, took off as well. How you mentioned the fact that teachers, right, they primarily, when they talk about, you know, okay, you shouldn't have posted it, you shouldn't have done this, that's the case. But it's also in terms of parents.
Yeah.
They're the primary culprits when we talk about, you know, not really supporting your child, giving the advocacy, okay, you know, it's fine, I'll give you a phone, this is your gift for your birthday, but they don't really tell you, hey, you know, it's okay, that's all right if you actually want to, you know, post a picture in any way that you want, which is obviously appropriately, but it's okay, right? The consequences that would come from that, that is how you have to navigate. So how would you suggest in terms of we change that mindset? How do parents need to sort of understand, hey, you know what, I need to be a support system for my child if they're going through this, you know, and not end up to something detrimental that we all see, you know, happen in Sri Lanka?
I think it goes back to what Sarita said about being able to speak to a trusted person, right? Why I mentioned teachers as an example is because when we were talking about that example of a curriculum, it's teachers who have to teach it, so then they need to be a little sensitive. But you're right, like for a lot of cases with children, right, the first person they reach to are their parents, right? So it's about what's the first thing they hear when they say someone is doing this to me online, someone is doing that to me online. And I think first of all, how much do our parents understand the online landscape, right? Like my parents to this day ask me to help them take a screenshot, right? So but then this is something even more serious. This involves speaking to like lawyers and the police and things like that. So I think we kind of have to go below a little bit and see and have that conversation with people from other generations and say, okay, like I know this is something foreign, you don't understand the legal landscape, and that's fine, the online landscape. We are also still struggling to understand algorithms and all these things. So it's about having that honest conversation and saying, okay, we don't know it, but let's maybe speak to experts. Let's see what our options are and then make a decision. And I think parents have to be really, really empathetic towards parents. I mean, we are also like, you know, next generation, you know, people who are going to be taking care of children. I have two nephews myself, and so it's very scary to think what children are going to be facing in the incoming generations, because even for us it's just too much, I feel. So you're right, I feel like we have to have that conversation with, you know, generationally to see, okay, how much do we know, how much do we not know, and it's okay that we're scared, but let's try to see what our options are, and then yeah,
that's very important actually. I'm going to swap a little bit to you in terms of, you know, when it comes to social cohesion, right? What do you really have to interject when it comes to this? Because at the same time we are advocating for it, but you know, how do we sort of balance everything off?
I'm just going to piggyback on what Nabila said in terms of how teachers and parents have to be educated about the online landscape in general. And I think intergenerational gaps are a lot these days, and that has to be first of all identified, and you know, we have to kind of have strategies to kind of fill those gaps or bridge those gaps. And the second thing is, again, digital literacy is very important to kind of have that social cohesion among communities, among intergenerational elements, and definitely digital literacy also have to be inclusive to make sure that, you know, all genders are included, all minority groups are included in that literacy aspect of it. And within this context, I think we need to ensure that in school curriculums or trainings or awareness or campaigns, we need to kind of integrate one, critical thinking and media literacy to kind of see how to identify hate speech, how to identify, you know, misinformation and so on and so forth. The second thing is you have to also kind of integrate online safety, and I think Sarita will talk more on the recent OSA bill as well as online safety to understand how to block, how to identify and report and all of that. The third thing is you have to understand algorithms, right? Algorithm is very important, because just to sensationalize a content, people will try to kind of change the algorithm, and we need to understand that and also make the users understand how to create counter narratives to kind of counter that. And the other one, which is very important for social cohesion or any kind of peace building, is empathy and communication. And when I say communication, it has to be very inclusive. So how to have dialogues, how to have negotiations in the online space, how to moderate certain content, right? So that is very important. And also have to have a like a deeper understanding of, you know, what gender is, what orientation is. Those are the basics, and it's not only the young people who have to know that, but also, you know, the other generations as well as the parents and teachers and so on and so forth. And also definitely community engagement within the digital literacy, because community engagement means that you have to work with peace building organizations, government authorities and other stakeholders, even the corporate, the media especially, to understand, you know, how we can kind of further advance social cohesion in terms of the online space, which will definitely manifest therefore to the offlines definitely, and therefore, you know, mass violence will reduce, there will be more understanding, and so on and so forth.
Can I add something?
Please,
like you said about the media, right?
Correct.
So like, I think the media also has a huge responsibility, right? Like to first pick on the positive narrative sometimes and communicate that to people, and also like how much do we trust newspaper editors or newspapers today, right? And I think that also has a lot to do with, you know, like, are they also being ambassadors for people who are spreading information that's not misinformation, and especially politicians as well, right? So I think all of us in our own roles, have a role to play
Yes.
in this. Yeah.
And just to add on to what you said, Nabila, also the question always comes up in most of my awareness or training programs with young people is, who decides what is hate speech, right? Who is that power given to, right? And then I remember this German philosopher, when they were asked, Hannah, the person's name is Hannah, when they were asked, this was in 1974 in terms of information to society. And what they said was, you won't have an opinion if you're not informed. And if all the information is lies, it's not about them believing all the lies, them not believing anything. So then that also means that they are vulnerable for us to use them in any other ways, right, in a very malicious way. So that's we have to be very careful when you're also giving that digital literacy, because this is very important. That
I found very interesting that you mentioned it, right? Because at the end of the day, when you're actually like educating someone, who decides whether it is hate speech? I mean, that's a big, question as well. But then that's the importance of, sort of teaching individuals, teaching children, teaching everyone. Hey, there is something called digital media. You need to sort of like understand, hey, this is how we work around it and all of that. But I also want to direct a question to you with regards to policy, right? I want to come back to that particular aspect of things, because that's the change. That's a primary step in terms of, changing this advocacy when it comes to, making sure that disinformation is not spread across social media, and of course, hate speech. The most important thing I personally would say needs to, sort of like take its expiration date, So what do you have to say in terms of policy? Because I think on a legal sense as well, what do you really have to interject there?
So maybe I'll start where Kiru stopped off, which is to do with definitions and how they evolve, and what a lot of people ask, like who determines what is hate speech, right? And I think that's a very valid question to ask also, because how we identify hate speech and disinformation also evolves, because the landscape evolves so fast. But when it comes to policy, I think there are very specific standards set for very good reason, and like things like the Rabat Plan of Action, for example, is like a 6-part test to determine what constitutes hate speech, which is defined by legal terms like incitement, right? Like these are very legal terms that you need to then prove. So Sri Lanka, I mean, we don't, it's not for a lack of laws in Sri Lanka, right? We've had the ICCPR Act for a very long time now. We have the OSA that was passed in 2024. We have the Computer Crimes Act that is from 2007. So we have sort of things like hate speech and disinformation and how to tackle these, and even things like image-based abuse enshrined within the letter of the law in Sri Lanka. The problem, however, is A, do they fit these sort of international tests, particularly in how they're implemented? And 2, what do we mean by like a effective legal or piece of law? For me personally, we can't take the law out of the system in which it operates, and we can have like 100 pieces of legislation, but if we don't have a system that actually works for it and actually is self-reflective enough to try and understand why this system exists, why these laws exist, that I think is the biggest gap. So especially when you think of Sri Lanka, one of the questions that often get asked, and particularly last year when the OSA was proposed, and there was a lot of resistance as well from civil society because of many manifest problems with it when it pertained to freedom of expression. And this has also been a criticism in the past of the ICCPR Act, particularly of its Article 3, that speaks very specifically about hate speech, but is often used to suppress a lot of dissent and freedom of expression. So when sort of these conversations reignited last year, one of the questions that kept coming up was, well, does Sri Lanka have a good enough policy or legal system, or does it have an adequate sort of system to deal with hate speech and disinformation? I think one of the things that unfortunately a lot of lawmakers and policymakers and people in this space also don't try to think of is, what do we mean by adequate, especially when you think of a law, especially when you think of a legal system. Is it adequate at protecting people? Is it adequate at preventing hate speech and disinformation? Is it adequate at punishing people for it? Like, what is it that it tries to achieve? So for hate speech and disinfo, we've had a lot of examples in Sri Lanka where despite the existence of these laws and despite the existence of systems like the CCID, the Women and Children's Desk Nabila talked about, CERT, all of these things, we've not been very successful with actually preventing these things from proliferating further, right? One of the more recent examples I can really think of is there was a brutal rape of a doctor in Anuradhapura a few weeks ago. And what happened was, while this horrific rape case took Sri Lanka, it was shockwaves, the sheer volume of hate speech against the victim, the sheer volume of rape threats, the sheer volume of rape apologia, people saying that maybe female doctors deserve to get raped and sexually assaulted because they are high and mighty and uppity, because women who are like that need to be taught a lesson, right? So we already have the OSA, right? We already have the ICCPR, we already have all of these laws. But we don't actually see a lot of action being taken under these laws because of also how the system operates. We also didn't see platforms being proactive in taking down a lot of content because a lot of this content existed on the platforms for weeks to come, right? Even if you look at the keywords now, you will see a lot of content. So I think the problem is not, do we have enough laws, do we have enough systems, but in the implementation, and how successful have we been at actually sitting down and thinking, okay, what system works for Sri Lanka? If we have these laws, how do we make it work for our people? Because one of the things that's really missing really in this sort of the biggest gap I see is the protection angle and the prevention angle. So with prevention, I think there comes digital literacy, there comes sort of these safeguards you put in place to make sure it doesn't happen. But
Can
the
I cut you
protection
off there
is
for a little bit
sure,
though?
yeah.
So if you compare, internationally and in Sri Lanka as well, how would you compare it when it comes to protection per se?
So I'll start off by saying no international legal instrument is perfect. I think we have some in Australia, we've got the DSA in the EU, we've got separate laws in the UK, Germany. We've got a lot of sort of local jurisdictional laws. I think EU is the only one that has sort of a regional legal instrument, which interestingly is also going through its own process of amendment and rethinking it. And I think it shows that no legal instrument can really be perfect because you're always playing catch up, right? When it comes to online harms and how to tackle it. The difference I see is in the sort of protection angle. The DSA in the European Union, for example, has very clear standards that platforms have to maintain, especially when it pertains to image-based abuse, protection of children, exploitation, things like very, very high standards. And they have to sort of report to a regulator who then makes sure that these standards are upheld. Whereas in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, the system that is set up by the OSA is to do with, there's a law that is pretty much taken from the Singaporean POFMA, a context that is vastly different to Sri Lanka. Singapore is one of the safest countries for women, right, in this region. Sri Lanka isn't. So it's a law that has been sort of copy-pasted here. And then the system is different. It would be a commission that would be under the purvey of the president's office that would then mete out whether or not something is offensive or hate speech or disinformation, and then you go through the legal process. While this commission can also send individuals like directives to take down content. I think the problem there is that they haven't quite focused on the protection angle, but rather gone sort of punitive angle. Whereas in things like the DSA, the responsibility is vested primarily in the platforms. Platforms need to be responsible to make sure that that the content on their platforms is not harmful, that there is no exploitation that happens, that when it comes to children and women and gender minorities, you have very specific standards, right? So it's the platform's responsibility. So I think for Sri Lanka, I think it's crucial that they also take a step back and rethink what legislation can look like and rethink it in terms of protection. Because we talk about online harm, and if we are serious about preventing online harm, one of the primary steps is to protect people who are most affected by it. But we still don't have a piece of legislation like that. But of course, I know that there's been talks of amending the Online Safety Act, and I think personally for me, I'm really looking forward to what that will come to be and how that process will happen. But one thing I would absolutely advocate for is if there is an amendment process, there is absolute necessity to also bring in particular stakeholders who worked in this beyond the sort of technocratic lens. I'm not just talking about people who work on like digital rights or people who work in lawmaking, but also people who work in women's rights, people who work in minority rights, people who work on elections, people who work on information disorders. All of these sort of viewpoints need to come together if we are to actually see a piece of legislation that at least tries to meet some of these standards, right? Tries to meet some of these thresholds and safeguards.
Okay, that's wonderful. I think that's very impactful as well. So thank you very much for doing that. Before I conclude right here on Gen XYZ, I want one word, just one word that would say that would impact anyone watching right now as well, that would really tell them, hey, you know what, this is important. What is that one word?
Oh, I would say, I don't know, I can't do this in one word.
One word, just one word.
I would say stay engaged,
Stay
really.
engaged.
Stay
I love
engaged,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. What's yours?
I would say equip. I think we
Equip.
need to
Nice.
really equip systems of like how things work and how we can change things.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
I thought about it.
You
Had
thought
some
about it.
time.
You thought about it. What's yours?
For me, it's prevention within communities, prevention also through design of social media platforms, prevention through legal elements.
Yeah, that's very important. Thank you very much once again for doing this right here on Gen XYZ. A very important message as well that came through you, and why you need to be very cautious when it comes to disinformation along with hate speech on social media as well. Well, in case you did miss out on an episode, we're available on YouTube.